Good evening and welcome to the show. I'm Caleb Bond, filling in for Sharri Markson for the rest of the week. Well, let's get into it. Here's what's coming up tonight. A hospital blast in Gaza has killed hundreds, with both Israel and Palestine denying responsibility. Meanwhile, Joe Biden is now en route to Israel, but his Arab Leaders Summit has been cancelled. Israeli politician Sharon Haskell and former intelligence analyst Paul Monk will give us the latest. The Labor government has blocked a crucial inquiry into abuse of Aboriginal children just days after it begged us to vote yes for their future. Bridget McKenzie and Andrew Charlton will debate the government's post-voice plans later. And former Qantas boss Alan Joyce appears to be hiding from the Senate at his mother's house in Ireland. He's been packed. Will he ever be made to answer for his airline's failings? More on that later. But first, there was a significant win for the little guy today, with the High Court ruling that state-based taxes on electric cars are illegal under the Constitution. Victoria, surprise, surprise, is currently the only state to levy owners of electric vehicles, but New South Wales and Western Australia were set to follow in the next few years. Now, the illegal tax meant that owners of electric and hydrogen vehicles had to submit a photo of their odometer to the state government each year, and they were charged 2.8 cents for every kilometre they travelled, and plug-in hybrid vehicle owners had to pay 2.3 cents per kilometre. If you failed to submit your mileage, you could be automatically charged for 13,500 kilometres worth of travel, $378, or have your rego suspended or cancelled. Victorian Ombudsman Deborah Glass slammed the implementation of this tax in a report last month. She wrote, quote, "Imagine buying an electric vehicle and then being charged for more kilometres than you have driven, because this average calculation is bound by legislation. Or travelling thousands of kilometres on fuel in your plug-in hybrid vehicle in remote parts of Australia with no charging stations, and being charged hundreds of dollars for road use despite having already paid the Commonwealth fuel excise on all those kilometres. Imagine finding your car has been deregistered even though you paid your rego because you failed to provide an odometer reading while you were overseas. And adding insult to injury, imagine then receiving a penalty charge for making a late declaration of the reading." She didn't mince her words. And now we find out the whole thing was illegal. This High Court case was run by Chris Vanderstock and Kath Davies, a couple of electric car owners. This was Ms Davies after a victory today.
We've all been whinging about this for a while, and it's a really heartwarming thing to know that we were right with our questioning of the constitutional validity of this tax.
Now, they launched the case in 2021, arguing that the tax was covered by Section 90 of the Constitution, which gives the Commonwealth the exclusive power to impose excises and duties on goods. Now, that, of course, would mean that the states cannot levy any kind of special taxes on electric vehicles. Now, the High Court's findings included two important points. The first is, quote, that there is no sound rationale for the assertion that a tax on goods in the hands of the consumer is, for that reason alone, not a tax on goods as articles of commerce. And that was Victoria's argument, that they were taxing a service, the driving of the car on public roads, rather than the car itself. The High Court disagreed with that. And the second point was that any tax on zero or low emission vehicles or any other goods, whether imposed at the stage of their importation into Australia or production or manufacture in Australia, or at any subsequent stage in their distribution, sale, ownership, control, use, resale, reuse or destruction in Australia or export from Australia, can be imposed only by uniform national legislation. Game over. The Victorian opposition has now called for all the tax collected to be refunded.
We've got Victorians who have paid this EV tax. We now know that it's unconstitutional, and the Allen Labor government must immediately assure those Victorians who have paid that money that they will get the refund that they deserve.
Now, this may not be relevant to many of you at home right now because you don't drive an electric car, but electric vehicles made up more than 7% of car sales in the first half of the year, and many people will own electric cars over the next decade. So this is something that we would all eventually have had to deal with. The states, of course, say they need to levy this tax because electric cars aren't filled with unleaded or diesel, and therefore they don't pay fuel excise. So, we have to slap a separate tax on electric car owners so we can get our fair share of money out of them to maintain the roads. But fuel excise is not levied by the states. It's a federal government tax. When you fill up at the Bowser, 49 cents in every dollar, thank you very much, goes straight to Commonwealth general revenue. That's not the state's money, and it never has been. And the feds make a pretty penny out of it. Fuel excise is set to net the federal government more than $60 billion between 2022 and 2026. It's then up to the Commonwealth how it spends that money. Transport Minister Catherine King spoke today in question time about electric vehicles and how we should make it cheaper for people to run cars.
This information will be absolutely critical to supporting households and businesses looking to buy more sustainable cars and cheaper to run vehicles. That is what this fuel efficiency is all about, making sure we have access to cheaper to run vehicles across all levels of our income spectrum in this country. The government has, of course, released our first national electric vehicle strategy, delivering on our commitment to provide greater choice for Australians to drive cars that are cleaner and cheaper to run.
Now, the argument that's often run for fuel excise and why we need to tax electric cars too is that that money is invested in road infrastructure. But according to the Australian Automobile Association, the proportion of fuel excise set to be returned to land transport infrastructure will decrease to 88% in 2025-26. So the government just creams 12% off the top for the excise for itself. The rest of it is invested by the Commonwealth in road projects where it sees fit. Now, this is where we get to the real nub of why the states wanted to levy these taxes on electric vehicles. When it was introduced in Victoria in 2021, Treasurer Tim Pallas said these reforms ensure all motorists pay their fair share to use our roads while we continue to incentivise the use of zero or low emissions vehicles. Introducing a road usage charge now before take-up increases substantially ensures that everybody pays a fair and sustainable charge for the use and the wear and tear on our road network, and that means safer roads. So, according to him, it's about fairness. And Pallas trotted out that same line again today after the tax was found to be illegal.
It appears that the law and the definition of excise seems to have expanded. We will need to take a bit more time to work out the full implications of that. But what we do know with certainty is that the zero and low emissions vehicle charge is invalid.
It hasn't expanded, buddy. You just didn't read the Constitution properly. I mean, how can you say it's fairness when you're charging someone an illegal tax? As we know, the states have never levied extra taxes on motorists to maintain roads. The states administer licensing and registration and fines related to traffic offences. That's how they make road revenue. The electric vehicle tax isn't about anyone paying their fair share. It's about the states finding a loophole to circumvent the federal government and levy their own taxes on cars. Or at least they thought they had a loophole. The High Court, of course, has now closed it. There's never been uniform spending of the money collected by fuel excise. It's never been about anyone paying their fair share or getting their fair share. The money is spent wherever the Commonwealth feels it is most needed. Fuel excise raised in Victoria is not spent exclusively on Victorian roads, and it's never been spent exclusively on Victorian roads. It's spent on whatever the federal government wants it to spend on, based on need. Those roads could be in Victoria, but they could also be in South Australia or Queensland or anywhere else. If the federal government were to levy its own electric car tax, it would operate in exactly the same way. But with this illegal tax in Victoria and the other states that plan to follow suit, they thought they had found a way to hoard the revenue for themselves. was never about fairness. It was just a cash grab. And it'll now be up to the federal government to decide whether it wants to legislate its own tax. But of course, if you want to encourage people to buy electric cars over combustion engine cars, why would you increase taxes on them? Well, let's bring in Sky News host Steve Price to discuss the stories of the day. Pricey, thanks for joining me. As we just talked about there, the Victorian government will probably be now forced to wind back the tax and perhaps even pay back some of the money it took from people after this High Court decision. I hope you agree with me that this was never actually about, your fair share. This was just a way for the states to try and levy their own taxes, even though it was illegal to do so.
Yeah, maybe, Caleb, g'day to you. They could, if they want to take the money back or pay the money back, they could take it out of Dan Andrews' retirement fund that he's currently spending while he's on holidays in New York. That'd be a good idea. That'd be very popular. It's very funny, isn't it? Because Victorian Labor tries to paint itself as one of the greenest administrations in the country, and yet they introduced in 2021 what now appears, according to the High Court, to be an illegal tax on electric cars. It was described by people who love electric cars, that I happen to hate, that it was the most unfair tax on electric vehicles anywhere in the world. And so suddenly these poor people, and I feel very much for the people driving a hybrid, I mean, how they ever got sucked into this as well is completely beyond me because, as you know, Caleb, half the time your hybrid vehicle's running on petrol or diesel. It's not running on an electric motor at all. But I think the point you made at the end there briefly is where this is all going to land in the end. The federal government in Canberra, they'll go, gee, Timmy Pallis was clever. He was going to gouge electric vehicle owners more money from road taxes. Let's do the same thing ourselves. And so we will ultimately, I think, Caleb, see a national electric vehicle tax.
Well, look, I'd be happy if there was no electric car tax and there was no fuel excise either, but I know that's pie in the sky. The fewer taxes we can have, the better. Now, an explosion at a Gaza hospital this morning killed hundreds of people, and it's the single deadliest incident since Israel began its retaliation attack. But Israel has denied any involvement in this, saying it was caused by a misfired Palestinian rocket. And then Palestinian sources say it was caused by an Israeli airstrike. It's all a bit of a mess, Pricey.
Yeah, it's hard to work out where the truth lies here, and I would hope that we find out rather quickly. I mean, what it's done, of course, is it's caused disruption to President Biden's visit to the Middle East. His summit in Jordan has now been cancelled. You would think with the sophistication that the United States in particular has, and Israel, that we would be able to work out reasonably quickly what happened here and where that missile came from. Now, in the middle of a conflict like we're in right now, Caleb, who do you believe? And this is going to have a major impact, I believe, on what happens next in this conflict. Now, you wouldn't be stretching it to think, well, if the Palestinians either mistakenly or horror to believe this, deliberately blew up that hospital to try and stall this invasion, the ground invasion of Gaza, that would just be horrendous. If the Israelis deliberately put a rocket into that hospital, then that's just beyond belief, and you just would hope that hasn't happened. But oh, look, I was in Europe last week. I was in the Middle East last Saturday, and the feeling there is one of great nervousness. And whatever you say about Biden, and I think he's a very ineffectual, president, and he's not got all his marbles. Going there is probably a pretty brave thing to do, and let's hope that he can in some way hose this whole situation down.
Indeed. No, I think the fact that Biden is going there today, is due to land tonight, will probably mean that ground invasion won't happen until next week anyway, because I highly doubt that they would do anything of that nature while he's there. Now, of course, one of the other big stories today, Chinese-Australian journalist Cheng Lei, who was last night on the Bolt Report with Annalise Nielsen, she told her that she was barely able to stand in her Chinese jail. She rarely saw natural light in her first tell-all interview since she was released. Here's a little bit of it.
12 hours a day of pure sitting, and very little chance to get up and just walk, just pace around the very little room.
Because you weren't allowed outside in that time at all.
No way. They say that they gave me 15 minutes of fresh air, but all it meant was there's a window up the top that the guard would open for 15 minutes, but the curtains are still drawn.
Now, you know, the reality is China is one of our big trading partners, and I'll talk later in the show about movements with the wine industry. But, you know, this is the kind of thing that a communist country is willing to do with people with whom it openly trades.
What an amazing woman Cheng Lei is, how she survived that. Now she's back talking to Annalise, who, by the way, I thought did an extraordinary interview last night.
Indeed.
That description of what happened in that jail cell was just horrendous. I mean, 12 hours a day, just sitting. She talked about how she taught herself 2 new languages and she read something like 200 books. But I do question, and look, you know, China is our major trading partner, no doubt about that. I do question Don Farrell's timing today. You have that extraordinary interview with Cheng Lei last night where she talks about how she was tortured, and let's not paint it any other way. She was tortured for the years that she was in that jail cell. Torture is putting someone in a dark room and not letting them stand up. Don Farrell today shouldn't have been talking about going and drinking bottles of wine with the Australian Chinese ambassador to try and get this dispute over wine imports going again. The timing was awful, Minister. I mean, you could have at least waited 48 hours or a week, or, I mean, put that back a couple of weeks when this poor woman is sitting here on Sky last night describing what the Chinese did to her.
I suspect there was a bit of quid pro quo involved in that release, as it were, and of course the deal that might be coming with tariffs. Now, finally, before we go, Steve, I've got to bring your attention to this Sister of No Mercy, she's been called, a French nun who decided to take perhaps a rather unchristian approach to her eco-warrior neighbours. So they were protesting the building of a new religious centre, and she wasn't having a bar of it. Take a look. What a legend, and forgive me for this, Pricey, but she was having none of it.
I reckon some of our female viewers who were taught by the nuns would have had a similar experience with nuns in the past, Caleb, if they'd done something wrong in the classroom just quietly. But they don't make nuns like that anymore. Apparently they do when they're overseas in France, but not here. What a champion she is. She can be the hero of the week, if you like.
Well, indeed. I reckon we need to bring her down here to sort out those Extinction Rebellion nut jobs. Steve Price, thank you for joining me. Well, coming up, Biden is en route to Israel and Putin is in China. Paul Monk will give us his expert analysis on what these movements mean, plus the latest from Israel with the Israeli politician Sharon Haskell. All that and more after this. Welcome back. Caleb Bond in for Sharri for the rest of the week. Well, Joe Biden is less than an hour from landing in Israel, but he's pulled out of his trip to Jordan after the King cancelled his planned summit where he was set to host the American, Egyptian and Palestinian leaders to discuss a way out of the Israeli conflict. The Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas had earlier dropped out in protest to the Gaza hospital explosion, for which he blames Israel, and Israel, of course, blames Palestine. Well, joining me now is writer and former senior intelligence analyst Paul Monk. Paul, what's your take? Who bombed this hospital?
Oh, Caleb, it would be out of place for me to speculate with any confidence at all. We need to bear in mind, as you more or less hinted a few minutes ago, that in war, a great many things occur that nobody specifically intended. And it's hard to believe that either party had a reason to kill 500 people in a hospital. So one hopes that it was a military accident. But like yourself, I'd be inclined to say, well, let's hope the truth comes out and let's hope it's not devastating.
Well, if it were to be that Palestine had done this itself, or Hamas had done this itself, it probably wouldn't come as a great surprise, because we know that Hamas uses human shields. It has instructed people to stay in Gaza in the hope that it makes life more difficult for Israel. But suppose it were to be an attack by Israel on a hospital. What would that do to Israel's wider pursuit in the global community if it were found that they were capable of doing such a thing?
Well, there have been people for many years alleging that Israel has done such things, mostly on a small scale, in its long-running war with both Hamas and Hezbollah, and on a smaller scale even in the West Bank. And so you can fully expect such people to jump up and say, of course it's Israel. Why would Hamas do that to its own hospital? If it could be shown that this was an act by the Israeli military, indeed that it was a planned act, then there would be a great deal of shock and horror in much wider circles. And I'd certainly be among those both shocked and horrified. What Israel needs at the moment, of course, is the support precisely of those among us who are most inclined to be shocked at the very idea. So let's hope fervently that it was certainly not Israel.
This cancelled summit, what sort of implications will this have for the US's relations with Arab nations?
Well, it's very striking that Biden has come out and said we're four square behind Israel. And of course, it's not a mystery given what was done in southern Israel. Nobody with any common sense, and there's unfortunately quite a few lacking it seems, would do anything but condemn in the most condign terms the massacre of about 1,300 civilians and the brutal things that were done to many of them, women, children, elderly people. It's just absolutely horrifying. So morally and psychologically, it's not surprising that Biden would take the stand that he has. But we've already seen that that has implications, because parties other than Hamas, who have mixed views of Israel, should we say, if not hostile ones, wanted to contain this conflict, and the US stepping in and saying we're right there with Israel has put many of their backs up, as we've seen. And of course, behind the scenes, never about to be involved in that summit in Amman, is Tehran. And Tehran is the real wild card in this whole process.
Yeah, I think the US was sort of backed into a corner, though. I mean, if they didn't back Israel, it would be incredibly damaging for them, Israel being the only democracy that exists in the Middle East. It's kind of something that we have to defend at all costs to some respect. Speaking of lack of democracy, President Xi in China has welcomed the leaders of Kazakhstan and Ethiopia as it puts on the charm offensive for its Belt and Road initiative. Now, you might say that courting developing countries could be somewhat at odds with growing China's power. We know that generally they've gone around trying to essentially buy up small Pacific islands with debt diplomacy. But with each country that it signs up to this global infrastructure and investment scheme, and don't forget Daniel Andrews tried to sign Victoria up to it too, that's of course one less vote for Taiwan at the UN, and it's one less Western ally, right?
Well, it is, although it must be said that China isn't winning a lot of real friends through the Belt and Road Initiative. And one could say that it really, although it's drawn a number of countries into what appear to be compromising debts, which is causing some pushback, you could say that its only real allies are countries like Cambodia, North Korea, Myanmar, all tin pot dictatorships. The wealthy countries in the world have all woken up to China's game. The Europeans, the East Asian prosperous and democratic states, the North Americans, ourselves. So Xi Jinping is up against it in terms of his soft power campaign, I would say. But the key thing is, of course, that he and Putin, and one must say the Iranians and the North Koreans, increasingly seem to constitute a formal axis, the objective of which is to weaken the United States and transform the world order. As Xi Jinping said not so long ago to Putin, we have the chance to change things more than has been done in 100 years. Given what's at stake, that's a really ominous stance that they've taken. And the breakout of war in the Middle East, in addition to the war in Ukraine, raises naturally the question, will Asia be next? Will China make a lunge thinking that the US is overstretched?
Indeed.
That's where my focus is increasingly.
Paul Monk, thank you for your time. Well, China says its tariff on Australian wine could end within weeks as Albanese plans to visit Beijing before the end of the year. Trade Minister Don Farrell says this has been months in the making.
We're continuing to do what we've done over the last 18 months, and that is stabilise our relationship with China, try and get back to sensible discussions with our Chinese counterpart, and in that process raise all of the issues outstanding.
Richard Dolan is the Joint Managing Director of Beck Hardy Wines and the purveyor of some fine product, if I do say so myself. He joins me now. Richard, this is obviously good news for the billions of dollars of exports that were crippled by this punitive tariff. You were at a briefing today in South Australia for South Australian winemakers like yourself from McLaren Vale and Barossa, Clare, etc., by the Department of Trade and Investment. What did you find out today?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb, and good afternoon to you and your viewers. The delegation that the Premier of South Australia led just a couple of weeks ago into mainland China, we visited Beijing, Shanghai, Jinan, and today's briefing was an opportunity for those of us that were on that delegation to feed back to colleagues in the South Australian wine industry about discussions that were had, quite senior discussions. The Premier led probably the most senior delegation to leave the state, certainly in over a decade that I've been involved in the export industry here. And it's fair to say that Premier moved the needle and built on the work that's been done since the election of the federal Labor government. Great work being done by Minister Wong and Minister Farrell, and certainly the Premier backing that up as well. And we're looking forward. It's another small step. The diplomacy and the diplomats are engaging on both sides. And fingers crossed, we hope for some positive news soon.
So obviously the suggestion that it could come within weeks, and this seems to be backgrounding that's coming from both the feds here and also from China. When you were in China a month or so ago, was there a feeling at that time that that decision was imminent, or is it perhaps something that's come along in recent weeks, post the release of Cheng Lei, for instance?
Look, certainly the progress has been made over the last 18 months. I think prior to the election of the Prime Minister Albanese's government, the contact at the diplomatic and political level was minimal. Over the last 18 months, there's been a lot of engagement. And it's fair to say that the people-to-people links, the business-to-business links are still very, very strong. There's a desire from Chinese consumers still for premium food and beverage, particularly from the great state of South Australia. And look, I think it's a matter of time, but certainly nobody. We were talking to the diplomat in Beijing, and certainly nobody there could give us a window as to when it could be done, because I don't think even they know at this stage. It's about really the diplomats on both sides engaging, coming to a resolution, and hopefully we all move on positively and progressively from there.
Export has been a large part of your business for some time. Just give us a bit of a picture. When these tariffs came in with China, how much of an impact did that have on your business, and how much of that were you able to make up by finding other markets?
Yeah, look, I mean, for us, it was a fairly unique situation. My wife and I actually executed a long-planned family succession plan in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic, shortly before the China tariffs came off. So fortunately, we had a plan to execute for other markets as well as continuing that piece in China. That didn't come off, so it actually allowed us to diverse resource. But, we've got some great business going in the US, Indonesia. A lot of people are always surprised to hear that Indonesia is actually our third largest market, but certainly Canada and North America have sucked up a fair bit of what we were doing. But, there's an impact here across regional Australia, South Australia particularly. We produce 50% of the total wine production in the country. 80% of all premium wine comes from SA. And, this has impacted regional and rural Australia greatly, and we're seeing that still. In South Australia, export puts over 60,000 meals on the table in an evening. And wine was previously, along with education and copper, from time to time, vying for that #1 position in the exports from SA. So any change to a major market, be it China, US, UK, obviously has an impact.
Indeed. Richard, we'll have to catch up for a drink soon. Thank you for your time, mate.
Look forward to it. Thanks, mate.
Well, let's cross now to Israeli politician Sharon Haskell, who is in Tel Aviv, where Palestinian rockets are now landing on day 12 of the Hamas-Israeli war. Sharon, welcome. How is Israel reacting to the news of this Gaza hospital blast?
Well, yesterday I already posted on my Facebook page videos from a camera that's constantly videotaping the area of Gaza. You can see there that was a rocket launch. It was done by the Islamic Jihad. One of those rockets was actually a faulty one, and you can see it returning exactly backwards. The rest are going towards Israel, and only one of them drops midway and come back towards the launching site. Now, unfortunately, the Islamic Jihad and Hamas are launching these rockets from dense populated areas, some hospitals and some schools. And when they have faulty rockets, they are murdering innocent Palestinian civilians. So what we saw yesterday is that the Islamic Jihad and Hamas are not just murdering Israeli children, but also Palestinian children. I can also tell you that within half an hour, the IDF spokesperson said they're going to go and they're going to show the foreign media a few proofs that anyone who have even basic information in military and war will really understand it, to show that that was not an Israeli attack, but that was the Islamic Jihad or Hamas rocket launches.
So how has this narrative of it potentially being an Israeli attack taken hold? Is this the buying of Palestinian propaganda?
Sorry?
So there's a narrative running that, as you acknowledged, that this was an attack, potentially an attack that was launched by Israel, and people are running with that narrative. The fact that that is being bought into when you say that there is clear evidence that it was done not by Israel but by Islamists, is that people buying into Hamas Palestinian propaganda?
Well, it's nothing new, because time after time Hamas is putting out propaganda and many people are buying that. They don't look for the facts. They're looking for something to justify what they think or what they believe. Time after time we post the proof and facts about what's actually happening. But unfortunately, with social media that is so viral, many people are spreading some of that propaganda. It's not easy to counter back that. I think most of the media, it advertised a lot of the facts, but then many people say another propaganda that all the medias are controlled or different things like that. I mean, it is very difficult, but we're trying to counter that in any way possible. That's why the IDF spokesperson is going to go on in half an hour.
Sharon Haskell, thank you for your time tonight. Coming up, Labor is pausing its truth-telling and treaty processes as it blocks a crucial inquiry into the sexual abuse of Indigenous children. Is this what The Voice would have advised? That's with Bridget McKenzie and Andrew Charlton up next. Welcome back, I'm Caleb Bond in for Sharri Markson. Well, if you're just tuning in, here are the top 5 stories you need to be across tonight. A blast at a hospital in Gaza is believed to have killed hundreds, with both Israel and Palestine denying responsibility for attacking the civilian target. Joe Biden is en route to Israel, but the planned summit of Arab leaders and the President of the United States has been cancelled. Dairy workers in Victoria are on strike for better pay, with milk shortages expected should the protest last longer than its planned 2 days. Glencore will close its copper mining operations at Mount Isa by 2025, affecting at least 1,200 employees and threatening the future of the remote Mount Isa community. And former Qantas CEO Alan Joyce has been spotted at his mother's house in Ireland as the Senate votes on a bid to bring him back to face questions over Qantas's many failings under his watch. Well, Shadow Indigenous Australians Minister Jacinta Price unleashed in an online video after her push for a royal commission into child sexual abuse in remote Aboriginal communities was rejected. Take a look.
I'm not going to give up. This isn't the end. And I know it's difficult for these survivors, but we'll continue to push and we'll continue to fight.
Well, let's bring in my panel for tonight. National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Labor MP for Parramatta, Andrew Charlton. Andrew, perhaps you can tell us why this was rejected.
Well, good evening, Caleb. Child sexual abuse is devastating. It destroys lives and it's particularly devastating in Indigenous communities. Child abuse in Indigenous communities is 7 times more prevalent than it is in the rest of Australia. In 2021, more than 14,000 Indigenous kids were the subject of abuse. But Caleb, the reason we know this is because there have been 22 reports and commissions into child abuse and neglect in Indigenous communities since the Bringing Them Home report in 1997. What we don't need now is another report or another commission. What we need now is action. And that's why the government committed $260 million in the last budget to specifically support Indigenous women and kids. That's real action to address this issue because we know how important it is.
But is that not to suggest, though, Bridget, I mean, look, a royal commission has much more widespread powers than any other kind of report or investigation would have. I don't see, given we had a royal commission into robo-debt, for heaven's sake, why this is the kind of thing that we would say no to. Even if we've had 22 odd reports before, this is a serious issue.
Well, absolutely, Caleb, and it's great to be with you. And I also, like Andrew, think that sexual abuse in Indigenous communities is abhorrent and it is something we need to deal with. And it is only the lived experience and truth-telling, shall I say, of both Senator Jacinta Price and Karen Little, 2 strong, powerful Aboriginal senators, that this has even gotten on the radar. We put billions of dollars into closing the gap and to programs that are supposed to address sexual abuse of children in Indigenous communities. There is no accountability for that money. And I'm not saying we got it right either, but this is an opportunity for the Labor Party to step up and back a good idea that's actually going to make a difference on the ground for these young people, because it is shameful.
Bridget, I'm sorry, I've just got to cut you off there. We've just got to go live to Tel Aviv, where the Israeli army is holding a briefing on the Gaza hospital strike. They're speaking now. They have just blamed Islamists. Take a listen.
At the Al-Hali al-Mahadani hospital in Gaza City. According to our intelligence, Hamas checked the reports, understood it was an Islamic Jihad rocket that had misfired, and decided to launch a global media campaign to hide what really happened. They went as far as inflating the numbers of casualties. They understood with absolute certainty that it was a rocket misfired by Islamic Jihad that damaged the hospital. Analysis of our aerial footage confirms that there was no direct hit to the hospital itself. The only location damage is outside the hospital in the parking lot, where we can see signs of burning, which I will show later, no cratering, and no structural damage to nearby buildings, as opposed to the damage caused by any aerial munition, which would have been of different nature. We would have seen craters and structural damage to the buildings, both of which haven't been identified in this incident. The size of the damage we see here is due to the warhead of the Islamic Jihad rocket, but most of the rocket's propellant is still evident due to the short flight of the rocket because the launch failed. The following visual evidence shows infrared imagery of the parking lot. You can see the central locations of fires, some debris of rooftops, no craters can be identified. I want to show you that myself. This is the area of the hospital. Okay, we are showing the parking lot and the hospital. Okay, those are in red spots. This is not in infrared, so you can understand it betterly. This is the parking lot. This is the parking lot. You can see the parking lot also now in this picture shown here. Okay, aftermath, after the hit. There is no structural damage to the building. The walls stayed intact. There are no craters here. All of the above, which I said, no structural damage. The walls stay intact, no craters. These are the characterized that shows that it's not an aerial munition that have hit the parking lot. We also have examples of what air-to-ground munition creator looks like. As you can see,
live press conference there out of Tel Aviv. Now, obviously, we've just heard a representative of the IVF saying that there was no structural damage caused to the hospital in this blast and that it was the fault of a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket. If we can bring back in now Bridget and Andrew. Bridget, your response to that? It's quite different from the news we heard this morning.
Yeah, and I think it's really important as these terrible events play out in the Middle East that we don't rush to draw conclusions because we need to make sure that we have a fact-based discussion here in Australia. The abominable, brutal, unprovoked, obscene behaviour of Hamas against innocent Israelis over last weekend has had ripple effects right throughout the Australian community, not just our significant Jewish community, but right throughout Australians who support, love the democracy of Israel and stand united with Israel and with our Jewish community during this time of need.
Andrew, we heard the suggestion there that the number of casualties in this attack or misfire, as Israel is characterising it, has been inflated. Should perhaps there be a little more care taken in the way we are treating this information, particularly when you saw this morning Palestine says one thing, Israel says another. The different permutations of all of this have very real consequences, not only for the way that Palestine responds to whatever Israel might do, but also the way that Israel responds to whatever Palestine has done.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I agree strongly with Bridget. We need to be very careful in this situation, not to rush to judgment. The attacks that we saw from Hamas were abhorrent, and now we need to make sure that as we go forward, we respect innocent life, that we value the lives on both sides. We don't rush to judgment about the actions of any individual group before we have the full facts in front of us. This is an extremely difficult situation for Israelis and Palestinians, and indeed for Jews and Muslims here in Australia, all of whom want to see their loved ones, their friends, people they know in their communities living in peace and security. And unfortunately, the events of the last week have made that very difficult to achieve in the short term.
But I think, Caleb, it is important to say that there is no moral equivalency between what Hamas did last weekend and Israel now making sure it defends its citizens. We heard in the coalition party room yesterday from the Israeli ambassador who thanked not just the coalition but obviously the government for their support, but made it very, very clear that the Israel government has, yes, a responsibility and also a duty to make sure that its citizens are safe.
Indeed. Bridget McKenzie, Andrew Charlton, thank you for joining me. And just recapping that press conference there, the Israelis, the IDF, confirming that this attack on the hospital was as a result of a misfired Islamic jihadi rocket and there was no structural damage done to the hospital itself, and that the number of casualties was inflated. We'll have more after this. After the break, one of the country's biggest copper mines is set to close, putting 1,200 people and a whole town at risk. Don't go away. Welcome back. Caleb Bond in for Sharri. Well, as we just heard from IDF spokesman Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, the Islamic jihadis are being blamed for this rocket that was fired at the hospital in Gaza. He's just been translating recordings from people, terrorists at the scene, that confirms what he was saying. I'll bring in now business editor, Sky News business editor Ross Greenwood. Ross, your response to what we've just heard?
Well, this is really the importance of just being sensitive about information in this part of the world right now. Obviously, markets, economies can be affected. Remember that Joe Biden, the US president, was to go into a four-way meeting, including with the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. And also King Abdullah from Jordan was to host that meeting with the Egyptian leader as well. And this is now been cancelled as a result of this attack, alleged attack on the hospital. Now, with the Israelis now refuting this, it does show just how sensitive it is, because quite clearly what the world does not now want is other Arab parties being brought into this war, that you have a broader Arab conflict, because that really becomes the worst nightmare, not just for the Western world, but for the whole world as well, and certainly for economies around the world which are so sensitive to oil prices and so sensitive to the politics of that region.
Well, the Rear Admiral has just translated a recording from the terrorists with them saying, "Was that us?" I mean, that would seem to be a pretty clear nail in the coffin about where all this came from.
Yeah, well, it's important also that Israel provides as much evidence as it possibly can in regards to this allegation of an attack on a hospital, because that is so politically sensitive in that region right now. And this is a reason why you can hear the Rear Admiral being as forensic as he is and showing the photographic evidence that they have got to prove that the Israelis have not launched this attack. Because remember, this is much about the sympathies towards the Israelis in regards to the initial attack by Hamas, but then also it's about where the sympathies lie long-term in the Arab world that doesn't actually create an even bigger conflagration in that region and therefore the rest of the world.
Well, you talk about the consequences of misinformation being repeated. The Rear Admiral has just blamed the media, the international media, for repeating Hamas lies. I mean, what are the consequences of this kind of thing, given what we heard this morning versus what we have now heard?
Well, you've got to understand that Hamas probably would want the rest of the Arab world drawn into this conflict. And that is something that was a reason, really, why Joe Biden has gone there to speak with the other leaders of the Arab nations to make certain it does not expand. Now, many people are pessimistic as to whether that can succeed, but certainly that would also be something that would play into the hands of Iran, which has clearly been funding and helping Hamas in its attacks that it's taken so far. So, you know, again, the sensitivity of the information, the sensitivity of the images is really all important right now. And there'll be more news, no doubt, about this as we go through the evening.
Indeed. Stay tuned to Sky News for all that coverage. Ross Greenwood, thank you for your time. That's it for me today. I'll be back tomorrow at 5 p.m. Stay tuned now for Peter Credlin.